Good afternoon. Dear professors, dear dean, dear students, and dear friends. It's an honor to be here and to hold this lecture, which inaugurates your academic year. I hope I won't be boring. The worst thing is to be boring, so I will try not to be boring. Coming to Barcelona is always for me a great pleasure. It's one of the cities in Europe that are most meaningful for me. It all started with Acantilado, with Jaume Valcorba, the great publisher, and now Sandra Olio, who is continuing his work. So now let me say this. Let me explain why this problem of the law in my talk. It's a kind of new interest for me. I live in Poland. And in the recent years, we have a government that is breaking the law. So it's a very strange situation because usually it's citizens who are supposed to break the law, but we have a government that's doing this. And it brought me to reflections. What is actually the law in our life? Because if you're a poet, if you love music and poetry and painting, you don't spend much time on thinking about the law. It seems to be from another planet. Here is art, here is beauty, and there somewhere there's the law, something severe and unpleasant. But it can happen that suddenly you think the law is a necessary part of our life. So I wrote this essay, which I am supposed to read for you. I will read and explain. I won't be reading in a straight way. I want to be more improvising upon this essay. So poets usually don't like the law. There are many poets who are instinctively anarchists. They think, what is law? Law is not for me. But as I say, and you know, interesting, there are very many writers who study law. Probably, I don't know so much about Spanish or Catalan writers, but I guess many of them studied law. Not out of the love for law, but simply cynical. Young people may think, oh, law is the easiest thing to study. You know, you don't need to go to the to study medicine, which is very difficult. Law is easier, and after I'm done with the university, I can do whatever I wish to. So there's this very strange relationship between many, like in Poland, Czesław Miłosz, a great poet, a Nobel Prize winner, and a really wonderful poet. He studied law. But I think with the moment he left the university, he never spent a moment, a minute on thinking of the law. So law is only a kind of circumstance for many poets. But if you think about it, in poetry there are other different laws. You cannot write a poem in a totally chaotic way. There are rules, and the dean explained to us the situation of a young poet who was told to write sonnets, right? So I've never written sonnets, which I'm ashamed of. But I understand the need to write formal poetry, and this even if you don't write regular poems, if you don't rhyme, you don't count syllables in your poem, you still have some structures to count with. You cannot, poetry is not about saying, you know, I'm sad or I'm happy. You have to find a way to make it convincing, to give examples, to create a structure. So there are some laws within poetry. And there's a kind of opposition within poetry between the spontaneity of feelings and the form. And this tension between the two is life-giving to poetry. You cannot have either or. I remember Joseph Brodsky, who always was looking for formal aspects of poetry, and he was faithful to the traditional norms of poetry. And sometimes it happens that someone showed him very formal poems written by someone else, which were very bad. And he couldn't understand how. Why are they bad? Well, they're formal, they should be very good. But apparently it's not enough for a poem to be formally perfect. A poem needs to have a soul, it needs to have an energy which cannot be, which is not delivered simply by the form. There is something else. I come from a generation which, as you know, as you were told, I was born many centuries ago, so right after the World War II ended. And when I was a young poet, a young writer, I decided together with some of my friends to spend some part or the large part of our writing on political problems. This was the time of communism, which maybe for your parents who lived under Franco, communism seemed to an attractive alternative. Not for us. For us, communism was a nightmare, was a dictatorship. So we tried to write in a way that would give a chance to freedom of thinking, freedom of imagination. And this generation was later called the New Wave by like the French generation of filmmakers. And so the essence of this new wave was a kind of polemic against the political system. But at this time, the very word freedom was a problematic word. For one thing, when the freedom is a word for philosophers and for politicians, but not for poets. There's no image behind the word, the notion of freedom. I remember when I was very young and I tried to write something about freedom, but it was never successful. With freedom, there's no images. It's not concrete. And poetry needs to be concrete. Poetry must appeal to images that are palpable, that are sensual, and not. And so you could go in a street demonstration. You can have a banner with the word freedom, but not in a poem. In a poem, it sounds like something very mechanical, and abstract. So the presence of law in poetry is also the law of the concreteness. Well, I say here that you can have poets who are like Ezra Pound or some Russian poets who are glorifying the dictator, Joseph Stalin. And so, again, this is not they were breaking a different law. They were breaking a law of humanity, because praising the dictator is contrary to human world. Now I have here a few short quotes from a poems by Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, who's not yet well known, but I think that he's getting more known in Spain and in Catalonia than before. He has a once famous poem, the Elegy of Fortinbras. If you remember Shakespeare's Hamlet, there is the figure of Fortinbras, who is the Danish prince. No, it's the Norwegian prince. And he appears at the end of the play when everyone is already dead on the stage, right? It's a very sad moment when it seems that it's over. But no, there's still Fortinbras who says, oh, now I'll put some order into the things. That now you will stop your chaotic life. And so Herbert wrote a beautiful poem, a very perverse poem, where he speaks from the position of Fortinbras, sort of against Hamlet. And Fortinbras in his poem says, I quote, "Adieu, prince, I have tasks, a sewer project, and a decree on prostitutes and beggars. I must also elaborate a better system of prisons, since, as you justly said, Denmark is a prison." And Hamlet, in the end of quote, and Hamlet in the same poem is presented as a kind of hysteric guy, unproductive. And the poem says, I quote, "Anyhow, you had to perish, Hamlet. You were not for life. You believed in crystal notions, not in human clay. Always twitching as if asleep you hunted chimeras." So this is an example of a poem which works through a paradox, because usually we side with Hamlet, right? It's a very few theater goers who would side with Fortinbras. But a poet can reverse the situation, can side with Fortinbras just to make it more clear where he stands, but through irony, through the opposition. There's another poem by Herbert, which is maybe one of his greatest poems. It's called Old Masters. It's a poem in which he praises the Italian early painters. You know, when you go to great museums, European museums or American museums, there are sometimes painters whose names are not known to us. We don't know who was behind this painting. And they're called after the motif they use. These are mostly painters who left only a few paintings, 1, 2, 3. And so they're called, like in the poem, the painter of the rain of manna, the painter of embroidered trees, the painter of the visitation, the painter of the sacred blood. So it's a very unusual situation that there are these great paintings. They are early, they sound partly naive, as we think, but not really. But we don't know who these people were. We don't know their names. And they are anonymous. There's this great anonymous artist, which gives them like an additional attraction, because we don't care this painter, what was the name of the painter. We have the art. And this poem is like a prayer to these old painters, to these painters who had no names. So for one thing, this is a prayer against vanity. you know, artists are very vain. Well, of course, not the speaker today, but mostly artists and poets have a problem with vanity. It seems that if you produce art, it's very hard not to believe in yourself. And once you believe in yourself, you believe too much in yourself. And then it can lead you to vanity, to think you are the best, or the other artists, the other poets are just nothing, you know. And certainly Herbert, as every poet, knew this temptation of vanity. So by praising anonymous painters, he was acting against his own sin, or the contemporary sin of vanity. There was a famous woman thinker in the 20th century, Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic who died very young. And she was saying that the only good art is the anonymous art. That she hated vanity. For her, the greatest art was the Gregorian chant, and we don't know who composed the Gregorian chant, or some other anonymous. It's very hard to find anonymous art, right? Because on every painting you have a signature, right? The painters love their signatures, but so she said that in a way, Herbert's poem was in a way a kind of response to Simone Weil. Yes, we need the we need the modesty in art, the modesty of someone who's working in art. So then in this essay, I try to understand what are other conditions for living in freedom. And I think that to live in freedom, you must live in truth. And truth exists where there is courage. Life in truth is threatened by many dangers. It's very hard to be free, even in private life. Sometimes we have to lie because we are not perfect, and especially in the social life. In some countries in Europe, in my country, there's a notion which you probably, I don't know whether you know this notion in your country. It's called historical politics. The government says, we will not, like in Poland, the Polish government says, whoever says that Poles did something wrong during World War II will be punished, which is absurd, right? It's because people are doing all kinds of things, and not everyone was a hero. The main problem for the Poles was, of course, how they behave because of the Holocaust. Did they help the Jews, who were their neighbors, or not? And the image is very, very complex. Some people did help. Some people denounced Jews. It's a very painful wound for the Polish society, which you need years and years to come to terms with such a problem. For many years, the kind of official line was there were no traitors. Everyone was helping the Jews. But there are many historians in Poland who are courageous and who say, no, look, many people didn't help the Jews. Many people denounced them to the Nazis. And there's a kind of meta-political question. What should you do? Should you, being a patriot, should you discuss these things? Or should you lie? Should you say, yes, everyone was a hero? So our present government has this kind of historical politics, which says all Poles were heroes. And I tell you, it's not true. Not all Poles were heroes, and all governments probably have this propensity to present their nation as beautiful and heroic. So now I skip a page, and the next thing I want to talk about is about books. There's a section in this essay which goes like this. Those who like to read books, and such people are still among us, maybe not that many, but there's still people who read books, and some people publish books, which is very beautiful. So I imagine myself sitting in my room and looking at the books in my room, and I see two kinds of books to make it not to enumerate all kinds of books, but the two main categories. The first categories are the books that have to do with the crimes perpetrated mostly in the 20th century. Books about the extermination of the Jews, books about the Great Famine in the Ukraine, about German concentration camps, about the Gulag archipelago, about the SS, but also about pogroms. There are biographies in my room, the biography of Stalin, of Hitler, biographies of Himmler, or even Heydrich, though I don't have a biography of Heydrich, I must say, actually. So there's a kind of interest, maybe a kind of morbid interest. We read these books about a recent history. We read Curzio Malaparte. I don't know, is he well known in your country or not? You know, the Spanish great journalist who was maybe exaggerating a little bit, but still worth reading. We even read, I don't read those, but there are people who read Goebbels' diaries. You know, I prefer Thomas Mann's diaries to Goebbels' diaries, I must say. But still, Goebbels is in many libraries. And there's, I don't know why, or I do know why, we are fascinated by this, by the crime, especially by the mass crime, mass murder. Maybe we are afraid that this could come back. Maybe there is a kind of deeper interest in not just sensationalism, not just that we want to know how it was, but we try to understand human nature. Maybe these books help us in this. The other books like that, you know, there are books by Vasily Grossman, the great Russian writer, with his novel Life and Fate. But there are many books by historians, like recently well-known Timothy Snyder, the American historian, and many other distinguished scholars of history. These are, in a way, necessary readings. We have to know these books. But then a question arises, if we can imagine someone who would read only this kind of books from morning to evening, from January to December. And if we ask ourselves, what kind of personality would emerge from such readings, then perhaps we would be seized, maybe not by horror, but by certain unease, because we cannot live exclusively beneath the dark cloud of atrocity. As we know, Shakespeare was the author not only of Macbeth, but also of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And we know that these two brilliant plays delineate, in a sense, the boundaries of our fate. So great writers are passionately interested in both, in the crime, but also in joy, in comedy. But then I look again at the books in my room, and and what do I find? Of course, I see many books of poetry, many collections of poetry, but I don't want to be a propagandist for poetry only. Of course, please read poetry, yes, but it's not my only intention to praise poetry. I look at these books, I see like a book or two on Glenn Gould, on the great pianist, Glenn Gould. Or there's a book by John Eliot Gardiner on Johann Sebastian Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven. I look at other books. I see a book on Franz Schubert, on Winterreise. I look across the shelves of my library, and I see books belonging to both categories. The one category is description of atrocities, of massacres. And other kind of books is the description of rapture. For instance, again, just quoting some of these books, I have 2 or 3 biographies of John Keats, the great romantic poet, who lived only 26 years. But there are many it's one of the amazing facts of, or events in the humanities, that this poet who died so young attracts biographers who can document almost every day in his life. Also because he wrote many letters. We don't write letters, so our biographies will be very thin, I'm afraid, if at all. Then I see essays. For example, there's an Italian essayist who died many years ago, Nicola Chiaramonte, who is probably not known here. A wonderful essayist. I see essays by Jean Starobinski, the Swiss philosopher and aesthetician who died a few months ago, I think. Then I see shelves with Miłosz, with a Polish painter and writer, Józef Czapski, who has now a kind of renaissance. There's a wonderful biography written by an American writer, Eric Karpeles, who published this amazing, beautiful biography. Józef Czapski was a painter and writer who almost died in Katyn. Katyn was this massacre of Polish officers who were prisoners of war taken by the Soviet army in 1939. And he survived by some miracle. And in the Soviet camp, he gave a series of lectures on Marcel Proust in French. So this is for me one of the most paradoxical images of 20th century. You have the Soviet camp with some Polish officers, those who survived miraculously the massacres, who were spared for some reason, and no one knows exactly why. And there's this Polish painter and officer, what's the English language calls the non-commissioned officer, like the not professional officers. And he gives a series of lectures on Marcel Proust in French to his colleagues, officers. We wish that every European country would have now officers ready to give lectures on Marcel Proust, but not in a camp, I hope. So I see also Joseph Brodsky's books, his essays and poems. I see albums of paintings by Pierre Bonnard, Georges Seurat, Alfred Kubin, the German-Austrian artist, Miquel Barcelon, the contemporary artist, Catalan artist, or Antonio Lopez. I see albums of reproductions by my Krakow friends, and I see, many other. It's not an. We just went to the library, so it's not a library catalog. I cannot talk about all the books, and I see many. As I said, many collection of poems. I see Antonio Machado, one of my heroes, or Mandelstam, one of my heroes. And but now, if you ask yourself a question, what do these two groups of books represent? And I think that the answer is not very difficult. They represent evil and beauty. Evil, which is always present, but which in the 20th century had a special ferocity. And on the other side, beauty. Beauty which has no address. We don't know where beauty lives. Where is beauty? Well, you can say that some paintings are in certain museums, but music certainly has no address. And so these two categories, evil and beauty, and the question is, what connects them? Is there any connection between evil and beauty? Without a familiarity with evil, we are like children. We are naive. It's easy to deceive us, to take us in. But if we restrict ourselves to this knowledge, we will be like prosecutors, like people who are inclined to musing in the attitude of gloomy bitterness, a bitterness that's certainly justified by the excess of material presented in all these books and other materials against totalitarianism and the functionaries of these systems, against the herd man. In a certain sense, it's true that the presence of beauty changes nothing in this ocean of evil. I was once struck by the significance of a particular date, the 27th of January. You remember, that's the date of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it's right now considered as day of remembrance of the Holocaust. However, it turns out that on the same day, the 27th of January, we also celebrate the birthday of Mozart. It's the same day. One of the great producers of beauty, if one can say so. One of the greatest composers and artists who move freely in every emotional register, from joy or even frivolity to the deepest sadness, to the despair of the requiem, from operatic arias to string quartets. So this collision of these two radically different circumstances, two contradictory references, Auschwitz and Mozart, falling under the same day, the 27th of January, should give us to think. But what are we to think about this? Is this an accident? Yes, of course, it is certainly an accident. Yet, since these two occurrences came to be linked under a single winter date in January, when the day is very short and night never ends, then it has a certain meaning and perhaps a certain sort of admonition. Even in a situation of radical evil, one should not erase this second reality, beauty. If it were possible to measure what there is more of, evil or beauty, I'm afraid that the result would not gladden us. there is a kind of asymmetry here. Evil is perverse and democratic. It can make a victim of every man and every woman. It can turn ordinary people into perpetrators and murderers. Whereas there is much to indicate that those people who respond to beauty are far from being in the majority. Recently, I came upon the theory that in the community, in the societies known to us, only about 4% of the population display an interest in more serious literature, more serious music, or plastic art. Only 4%. And evil can, after all, endanger an entire society, 100%. And yet, the existence of this second pole, of this pole of beauty, changes something in the structure of the world. This apparent elitism of beauty should not discourage us, all the more since it might turn out that everyone, after all, and not only these 4%, is in some way sensitive to very different variants of beauty, from folk art and mass culture all the way to the works of the avant-garde. Why am I speaking of this? Perhaps I'm mistaken, but it seems to me that one cannot be free unless one stands between them, between beauty and evil. In other words, if one does not endure in vigilance with regard to these two great powers, so very dissimilar to one another. Life in freedom is not possible without a certain elementary knowledge or wisdom, without an elementary sensitivity. And one of the main elements of this sensitivity is, or perhaps should be, a consciousness of dwelling between evil and beauty. Obviously, this asymmetric opposition between beauty and evil, we will find, apart from this opposition, we'll find other oppositions, good and evil, beauty and ugliness. And I don't want to say that good and beauty are equal. Beauty may be ambiguous. A beauty separated from the most distant association with vigilance with regard to evil leads to an unpleasant rhetorical aestheticism. In this web of tensions, other powers and energies also appear. For instance, compassion, which Schopenhauer extolled before it was erased by a certain unruly student of his, Friedrich Nietzsche. But this is not a lecture on German philosophy. So there was yet another German thinker, Christian Friedrich Hebel, who said that compassion is not so valuable, that he saw it as a cheap feeling. He preferred mutual joy. But I don't agree with Christian Friedrich Hebel. I think compassion is an important part of what we are. We know that compassion was praised in the East by Confucius, by the Buddhists, etc. Compassion cannot improve the human world, but without it, this world would be transformed into hell. And then I have here a paragraph on smiling. I also think that the world would change into hell if there were no smiles. This might sound frivolous to mention smiles when one is speaking of freedom. But I think smile, such a small thing, is very meaningful. It has nothing in common with comedy. In certain languages, in Polish or French, the word smile does not detach itself from the word laughter. It appears as, so to speak, a variant of laughter. But it's not a variant. It's very different from laughter and very different from comedy. the smile is for humans like the soft sign in the Russian language. It makes people softer. It creates a moment of softness between people. Were I a philosopher, I would write a treatise on the smile, about the way in which it changes the face of a woman or a man, how it brings about the hard lines of the face of someone inattentive, absent, sometimes perhaps full of aversion, or indifferent, exhausted, or depressed, suddenly softens and sends to us a signal which says, I am a human being, I'm not so bad. Perhaps it even says something more, I'm free. But on the other hand, I know that if you work for a corporation, they tell you have to smile. So I saw recently a T-shirt with the slogan, fake your smile. So, there are not only fake news, there are fake smiles too. So I don't, again, it's not the conclusion that, I'm not saying that the smile is enough for freedom. And also, I think each of us saw sometimes photographs of smiling SS members. So that's not what I mean. I think my time is almost over. There's smile, but there's also joy. Another great theme, which can only be hinted at here. There's a note of Bach, who is supposed to have written after the death of his first wife and of 2 children, the following words, O God, let not joy abandon me. It's very, to write these words in such a moment. This I praise the joy without forgetting all the other things. And yet, I'm finishing. We have to admit that the situation of our world is rather gloomy. We see the return of political movements, which we had thought to find now only in history books. We see the return of statements and viewpoints which recall the atmosphere of the worst decades of the 20th century. Not long ago, I witnessed a public debate in Krakow, during which one of the participants complained that our times, constrained by political correctness, do not offer us the freedom of discourse assured to people in the 30s, in the 1930s. This means that basically it's today still not quite the done thing to openly defend nationalism, fascism, and anti-Semitism. So then I praise the political correctness, and I don't want to return to the 30s. The madness of the 1930s, which Catalonia and the whole of Spain experienced so painfully, again pounds at the doors of our countries. We hear voices arriving to us from the past, attempting to gain access to our homes, aiming to poison the air we breathe. We hear that liberal democracy has ended, that we must give a chance to more muscular methods of rule. Many spoke in a similar way precisely in the 30s, and that did not end well. We are told here and there that the nation is above the law. It is for many above everything. In my country, many Catholic priests seem to worship the nation much more passionately than they do Jesus. Despite these new threats, the politics of freedom, the defense of democracy, demands that we should always be passionate also about something else. It is for this reason that professional politicians seem to us sometimes like entities who somewhat compromise their humanities, entities that are slight caricatures. Not all of them, but very many. It is as if significant part of their soul had been amputated. At times we cannot be sure if we have to do with human being or a robot. The source of inner freedom cannot be replaced by an algorithm. The specialists assure us that in contrast to the computer, a human being cannot be steered with the help of an algorithm. Because it is, I think, the case that humanity cannot survive without a certain excess, an excess of curiosity, an excess of passion, an excess of consistency, and an excess of inconsistency, an excess of excess. Thank you.